Thank you very much. Bonjour. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Andrew McClelland, Director of Operations at IMRG. Recently taken charge also of some of the policy area, so I'll be touching on that a little bit later as well. Just to give you a very brief overview of what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. IMRG's got about 1,200 members in the retail sector and about 150 members that supply the retail sector online. Our role really is around, as an industry association, but also providing up-to-date industry statistics, market analysis, and really best practice guidance for our members. Part of this process has been providing an index overview for the last 12 years now, which I'll go into a little bit more detail. Also start talking about some of this multi-channel, cross-channel talk. An awful lot has been said about it in the past. It's no doubt very important now, certainly for some of the big high street brands where the City of London are now looking very closely at an online retailer's proposition, how it fits in with their offline proposition, and indeed, have they got too many stores now? We also launched recently a quarterly benchmarking report, which I'll go into in a little bit more depth, and a bit more detail around some of this multi-channel stuff. Mobile, online, high street, how does it all come together? A little bit about international. Certainly the UK market is maturing and UK retailers are now looking to see where their next levels of expansion are going, particularly when we're used to double-digit growth. And then a little bit about something that's coming up. Cookies, some changing in legislation for the European Commission, and also data protection. And finally, a little bit of crystal ball gazing. We'll start looking into 2012 and seeing what we think is going to happen there. So some background around the index. We've been running it about 12 years now. We've got over 100 retailers providing us with monthly sales data from their online channel. So our definition for that is that the transaction actually takes place online. It doesn't include click and collect where you actually pay for the purchase in store. It's got a mixture of high street and pure play, a catalogue as well, but all have an online presence. And some of the key metrics that we've been tracking include basket size and conversion rates. Graph on its own doesn't really mean much. It looks great. It's all pointing in the right direction. It's all heading north. Interestingly, if you look through the curve, actually there's similar trends come out year on year. But the overlying trend really is that we're seeing continued growth. So taking a quick look at Christmas 2011. I think over the past few years, Christmas is obviously the major trading period for online retail and all retail indeed. But we've seen a couple of interesting scenarios come along that have upset things a little bit, particularly around 2008 time where consumers were actually holding off making purchases. So we've got this financial crash going on. Retailers have already bought their stock and committed to stock for one projection, and actually all of a sudden consumers are thinking in an entirely different way. So I think it's worth bearing that in mind as we move forward. 7.9 billion for Christmas. Now we count the Christmas trading period as the 8 weeks prior to Christmas, but up to 5 days before Christmas Day itself, 5 working days before Christmas. This is really to allow for last-minute deliveries, but indeed tries to cut out some of the issues around deliveries that are ordered before Christmas but don't actually arrive until after Christmas. We saw a 12% year-on-year, but month-on-month increase, sorry. Now, November itself was pretty strong, so actually 12% for December was very good. But really looking at some of the sectors, beers, wines and spirits, generally it's a bit of a strange sector to measure. It goes up and down, and for no apparent reason, obviously very popular at Christmas. However, we had a particularly strong Christmas this year. Health and beauty has been a little bit later to market, and a number of factors behind that, and certainly is similar to fashion, where fashion has really only just started coming off the blocks in the last 18 months to 2 years. Rich media's got a lot to play with that, but also social content and social drivers have really helped people drive the online business for health and beauty products. Home and garden, really, I think the strength in that sector reflects the fact that consumers aren't actually moving now as much as they used to. They're not moving home as much. They're actually looking to do more with what they've got, freshen things up. So that's, again, a very strong area. And rich media is playing a big part in that. So whether it's video, whether it's high-resolution photographs, the ability to zoom in and out of pictures. Now, I'm sure that you're probably aware that there's an awful lot of guessing that goes on in the run-up to Christmas as to what's going to be the peak week and what's going to be the peak Monday. In the US, they call it Black Monday. We try and avoid talking about a specific day if at all possible. But more or less, it relates to payday in November when people get their salaries. The following weekend, they then start to do their searching and their research. And then the following Monday is when people then go online and make their purchases. So the chances are they're actually going out to the high street, looking, touching, feeling, and finding the sort of products that they want, but rather than facing the queues in store, they're then going home, perhaps looking for the best price, and then making their purchase online. Now, I mentioned the particularly strong growth that we had. What we need to bear in mind is that it was actually off the back of a very strong November of last year, where we saw 20% plus up. And that was really due to the amount of snow that we'd had in the UK, prevented people going out, prevented people from going to work, but they still shopped online. Needless to say, some of the press then cottoned onto the fact that, well, if you can't get to the shop, what are the chances that a delivery agent is going to be able to get to you and deliver the products to you? But overall, I think the industry performed very well. This really is just reflecting that summer is always relatively strong, or spring. Going into the summer, it always backs off, and that's holiday season. People are thinking about spending their money on other things. But interesting, when you look at the dive after Christmas, so the post-January sales, when you look at the bottom line of where we drop down to, that's generally the starting point for the following year. And so far, the trend is that that hasn't been below the point at which it started to kick up in October for Christmas. One of the other interesting things that we've really started, fairly recently measuring, is the difference between high street multi-channel operators and pure play. Now, there was a big difference in early 2010 when we started measuring this. A lot of that has actually got to do with the fact that the high street brands really started investing very heavily in their online presence. They started taking it seriously. They started realizing that it could make money for them. And they started promoting it in store. They started promoting it on the sides of their lorries going up and down the motorways. They started promoting it on bags and literature. And if you're an online newbie, it's the first time that you've gone onto the internet, and there's an awful lot of people out there that are still like this. Perhaps use it for the odd email, but don't really use it for much else. Who are you going to go and shop with first when you first try online? Well, of course, you're going to try the brands that you know and trust from the high street. So this really accounted for why they had the largest levels of growth in the early days of 2010. We're actually seeing that difference reducing now. And part of the reason is that those people back in 2010 that tried it out for the first time, they generally had a good experience, and they're getting a bit more adventurous, and they're starting to try new brands, and they're starting to go to some of the pure play operators. They realize now that not all pure play are out there just to rip you off for money. They're actually proper businesses with proper customer service and can get proper products and services to you in a timely manner. I mentioned earlier some of the quarterly benchmarking that we started doing. This is really at the request of a number of retailers who wanted to understand at a much more granular level what was happening in the marketplace. Now, we've always been restricted by this sort of data that retailers themselves could provide us, but we set out with a pilot group early last year, starting to build up data and where possible get back data as well. And we're starting to look at some of the areas that you can see on the screen here. I think one of note certainly is 8.2% of visits to UK retail websites were via a mobile device in 2011, and 5.3% of online sales were by a mobile device in 2011 Q4. And I think one of the things that's becoming very obvious to retailers is that mobile is the way forward. It is perhaps the glue that holds the different channels together. We now have that golden egg whereby we can track a customer that's buying something online. Potentially with the right privacy controls, we can track them in store. And with the right consents and permissions, we can actually build a picture of their behaviors across all of the channels and provide them product offerings that reflect their choices. I think it's also worth noting that a number of retailers that we've been speaking to, there's often been this debate around, do I go down the app route or do I have an m-commerce enabled website? The retailers that have really gone down both routes have noticed a big change in that consumers really want the m-commerce site. They want the mobile-enabled website. And for the Apple users, that even if that means that they get a degraded user experience because you can't get Flash. So yes, Apple has its place, the app has its place, certainly around store locators as a customer service tool and as an extent a conversion tool. But one retailer I was talking to, there's 1% of their sales came through an app versus over 5% and increasing on a mobile-enabled website. Another interesting area to look at is, and one of the other hats that I wear, is around cybercrime, cybersecurity, and payment fraud. We're starting to see that 3D Secure is having an effect on fraud. The technology that's being employed and the types of tools that retailers are using are getting much better. We're reducing the amount of false positives, and overall, the fraud rate online is reducing. Obviously, in the UK, we're slightly unique in that over 90% of all transactions are through a card, but I recognise that's very different in different territories through the EU. So on to multi-channel. Very much a buzzword at the moment, very much, certainly for the last 2 years, retailers have been trying to understand what it means. Are you multi-channel? Are you cross-channel? And frankly, the point I want to make is what channel? It's all very well understanding these things in different silos. But as a business, retailers need to understand that they need to work together. These channels need to link together very closely. And just to illustrate a little bit of this, we get an awful lot of buzzwords, latest technology is being discussed, and the next must-haves. So on the technology front, there's a huge amount going on, from HTML5, all the latest developments in browser technology. Indeed, we're even talking with HTML5 about browsers potentially disappearing altogether. But really, I think what we need to do as an industry is stop and think. Is IT driving the business, or is it empowering the business? And I think there's two distinct differences there. Technology as an empowerment, as an enabler for the customer to trade more effectively with the business, absolutely. But should the latest solution be looking for a problem? That's always a challenge for IT. It's always been a challenge for software developers about trying to find a way that this particular solution fits into the marketplace. Then we start talking about channels. Well, actually, we shouldn't be talking about channels. We shouldn't be talking about technology. What we should be talking about is the customer. The customer shops with a brand. They don't shop with the technology. They certainly don't shop with a channel. Each purchase that they make and each transaction will be different. They'll have different preferences for different transactions and indeed potentially for different retailers. So really the message here has to be that as a business, whether you're a retailer transacting online or whether you're a brand who's trying to communicate with consumers, it's understanding your model. It's understanding the sorts of consumers that you've got. It's understanding the way that they interact with you and want to interact with you and providing services that fulfill those needs. It might be, out of all the various channels, you choose a couple that are most appropriate to your customer base. But at the end of the day, it has to be the customer that you're servicing. It's not about just jumping on the bandwagon because lots of the press have been talking about the latest app or something. It is about holding back, understanding your customer, and understanding how you service those needs. And I think technology certainly plays a very important role in this industry, no doubt about it. It is why we have the industry that we've got today. But I think we're now in a situation whereby, whereas in the early days it was about website programmers that wanted to make a bit of money out of it, now we're talking about serious business and how does technology help us fulfill the aims and the requirements and the desires of our customers. So really it comes back to the brand. What's the brand trying to do? What's the brand's customers look like? How do we service those requirements? So if I take one example, social commerce, and in fact I presented earlier this week at another conference around social commerce. Again, it's the buzzword. It's the latest thing to be talking about. There's a huge amount of consumers are online, are using various social networks. Obviously, Facebook is probably the most popular at the moment, but these things change. But there was an interesting quote from Forrester, an analyst at Forrester, that said, trying to sell something to someone on Facebook is a bit like trying to sell something to your mates down the pub. People are in the pub because they want to drink, they want to relax, they want to talk. We are social animals after all. So is Facebook really the way to go for a commercial transaction? Certainly there are examples where it's been very successful. But I would suggest on a broader level that for the majority of brands, be it retail or others, it's about customer relationships. It's about having conversations. It's about understanding some of the issues that you've got as a business. So we know several retailers that are actually using social commerce as a feedback mechanism for their merchandisers and for their buyers. Because if you're going to find out about a problem about one of your products or services, your customers surely are going to tell you about it. And Usio did a very interesting survey earlier this year around the travel sector. And 68% of those customers that had a problem with a travel service or a holiday, 68% actually lodged a complaint via a social network. 22% of them actually received feedback from the travel agent in question. And of those, 18% then actually reported back a more positive feedback situation. So actually we've got a channel whereby we can talk to consumers, we can have a conversation with them, we can understand more about them, and more importantly, as long as we're heard and being taken seriously and don't promise things that we don't deliver, consumers are very happy to be engaged on that process as well. Now there we go. The next thing I'd like to really talk about, and I know I'm whizzing through some of these subjects, and actually some of them could do with a session all by themselves. International trade, focusing on the EU. European Commission have realised that digital is blowing holes in this idea around a single market, because there are numerous laws and legislations in different territories that don't match up, make it very difficult for businesses to trade cross-border, let alone consumers to trade cross-border. So they're undertaking a wide range of work under the digital agenda to try and level out the playing field a little bit and remove some of these inconsistencies. But let's not forget there are an awful lot of businesses that are out there doing it already. And actually with 22% growth in 2010, certainly in 2020 to 25% in 2011, we're seeing it slacken off a little bit when compared to other areas. But notwithstanding, when you're starting to look in mature marketplaces such as the UK or maturing marketplaces, where retail is going to go to the growth? Certainly to their European neighbours and perhaps further afield. So if we just look at a bit of a global picture now, because if you're a European retailer, yes, there's lots of potential market growth there, but actually where's the stellar market growth coming from? And actually it's outside of Europe. The economies of Europe are fairly flat. Consumer sentiment is not exactly rosy. So actually we need to start looking further afield for that growth. And we need to be a little bit careful when we start talking about figures of the number of people in certain populations in certain territories, because at the end of the day, how many of them will have internet access? And more importantly, how many of them will have disposable income that they can use on retail purchases? Having said that, there's a number of UK retail brands, certainly in the fashion sector, that have started trading into Australia, for example. Now, interestingly, when you're developing a range for the UK, summer range, for example, once you get to the end of summer or partway through the summer and you're starting to introduce the autumn range, you've then got to start getting involved heavily in discounting. If you start selling to somewhere like Australia, you don't necessarily have to have discounting. You might introduce a little bit at the end of the summer season just to keep some of your loyal customers loyal. But at the end of the day, you can then sell that stock into another territory that is also experiencing summer, and thereby reducing the ROI on your range development costs. So actually you can start looking at some of these relationships with different territories and how they suit your business model. And I would certainly recommend that when you're looking to do international expansion, it's about how it fits with your current systems and your current setup, rather than having to reinvent yourself completely just to compete in a different territory. So when you're starting to look at cross-border trade, what are some of the interesting areas here that I've just pulled out? By no means a definitive list, but certainly I think some areas worthy of consideration. So if you're looking to trade into a different territory, you've got different payment issues, different payment methods. Germany's 15% card penetration. Most of it's cash on delivery or direct debit. Whereas in the UK, it's 90% card penetration. So for a UK retailer going into Germany, it's a big culture shock to realise that people pay by direct debit and pay cash on delivery. You've also got language issues, which is an obvious one, but also culture. You might think as a business that you can just get some people in that speak a variety of different languages. They don't necessarily understand the nuances of each culture. So if, for example, you're looking at your SEO program, how would you relate that to the local culture, the local terminology, and indeed the local trending? You really need native speakers to bring you that sort of insight and that sort of knowledge. Legal, this probably isn't the forum to discuss the legal regime too much, but suffice to say that we're not in a single market, and it's certainly very different across each territory. If you go outside of the EU, then indeed you've got even bigger issues. So, for example, in China and India, a substantial shareholding of your business in that territory needs to be locally owned. So you might not necessarily be in the driving seat for your destiny in those territories. Inventory management is an obvious one. If you've got stock floating around the globe, how do you get it back into circulation and resell it as quickly as possible? And that brings in reverse logistics. You're shipping into different territories. How do you get that back? Germany, for example, has still got free returns. Now, for a lot of UK retailers, that's a potential headache. That's potentially all their margin gone. So again, these sorts of things need careful consideration. And finally, you might have a very strong brand in your domestic territory, but if you're going somewhere new, they won't have heard of you. You need to ensure that you've got that customer support and that customer confidence and being able to support those transactions and support those customer queries. So just a couple of elements of the legal side. I think both worthy of mention because I think they heavily impact the IT industry. Cookies. The legislation changed on the 26th of May last year, where we now have to get explicit consent before we download cookies onto a user's machine or a subscriber's machine. And this is the first time, there's a major change in the way that we're expected to gain consent. We're now talking about, for all intents and purposes, full opt-in. In the UK, we've got a fairly pragmatic regulator, and they've given us a year's grace to reach compliance before they start really kicking the doors down and potentially fining people. But they also understand some of the technical issues of trying to implement this and the impact that it will have on customer journey. The one that's really kicking off now was recently launched by the Commission, by Viviane Reding, is a new data protection regulation. And this will see some major changes in the way that we handle customer data, how we process it, who processes it, and who has responsibility if things go wrong. So just a couple of headlines. You will need to have a data protection officer if you have more than 250 employees. If you're a non-EU business, you will have to have an EU-registered relationship with someone that represents your data protection interests within the territory. We've got data portability, so a customer can come along to you as a brand and say, I want to take a copy of my data from you and give it to one of your competitors. Now, you have to give it to that customer who could then go out into the marketplace and find out who's going to give them the best incentive for giving them the information. Coupled with a right to be forgotten, all of a sudden you've invested a lot of time and effort in building up this customer database. The customer can then turn around to you and ask you to delete it, forget all about them, apart from legal documentation. Now, the headache for that alone, once you start taking into account social media, where can their comments have been posted? It might have been on your Facebook page, your company's Facebook page, which then gets posted on elsewhere. Where does the line stop? How much responsibility do you have over that? And then, of course, we're looking at new level of fines and also breach notification. So you will have to publicly announce that you've had a data breach in future. So just to finish off, just some predictions for this year, and I think probably moving into 2013. No surprises there in that we will see a closer integration between the high street and the multi-channel and the online brands. And also, catalogue, I think, is playing an important part, with many pure plays now finding value in producing a catalogue for their customers. International expansion, absolutely, as the markets mature in Europe, more and more people come online and gets more competitive. Where can businesses find that next level of exponential growth? Mobile has got to be the story of the moment, and I see no reason for that to discontinue. In fact, we're predicting within the next 18 months that online transactions via a mobile device could actually overtake those that are done by a desktop device. And then finally, just on the m-commerce point, in 2010 we were looking at 0.9% of all online transactions. Just a year later, we're looking at 3.8% and growing. And on that note, I'd like to say thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.